Hello, and welcome to this latest episode of season 4 of Raising the Roof. I'm Nick Atkin, and you're listening to the podcast that brings together business leaders and industry experts to unpick the hot topics, not just in housing, but also much, much further. In today's episode, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined by Catherine Asta. Catherine is an award-winning psychotherapist, writer, podcaster, advocate for women's health and inclusion, and also discovered later in life her own autism. So, for a podcast host, that's a scary list of subject matter expert topics that you cover. So, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Raising the Roof.
Thank you for having me, Nick.
Great to have you here, Catherine. Particularly because we today are going to be diving into a topic that every workplace needs to be paying attention to, and that's neurodiversity. And for those who are listening and are thinking, "Oh, well, what does that term mean?" Well, my understanding is that basically people's brains work in different and very unique ways, and that means that we all experience the world differently as individuals. So neurodiversity is simply a term that includes all brains, and it's part of human diversity. I know we've talked a lot on this podcast about how to bring innovation and creativity and unique problem solving skills into our business thinking. But what's interesting is, and certainly we'll talk about your books, but certainly when I was reading one of your books, what became really apparent to me is that people who are neurodivergent have many strengths, and those are the strengths that we've talked about previously on this podcast that workplaces need to tap into. But unfortunately, workplaces can fail to create that safe and supportive environment where neurodivergent colleagues can thrive. So I'm really, really absolutely over the moon to have you on the podcast today because I know that you've got a really inspirational story and you relay that through your podcast, The Late Discovered Club. I don't often promote other people's podcasts on this pod, but we're making an exception for you because it is a good one. So we'll kick things off, Catherine. You've got a really inspirational story of being diagnosed with autism later in life, and this has driven your real desire to help others. So could you just share a little bit about your personal journey and particularly how your diagnosis changed your perspective, not just on your career, but your life more widely?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Yeah, it feels very strange to be in the other seat today, um, talking about myself. But yeah, my late autism discovery, it's something I talk about in my book, about coming home, my coming home story. And for me, like many other people in our late discovered community, my light bulb moment for me was motherhood, having this kind of mirror being held up to me and never really have caught my reflection in it before. So I spent 4 decades of my life just thinking that life was really hard, not knowing that I was autistic. And when life feels hard, you just keep trying harder and
Uh,
harder and harder. And I think, well, how could I have possibly known that I was autistic? Because I grew up in the 70s, 80s, 90s. I can't tell you any female autistic role models growing up during that time. Even studying psychology, did my undergraduate degree in psychology over a quarter of a decade ago, 25 years ago.
uh,
And it wasn't until I did my psych masters back in 2020 that I was actually taught anything about neurodevelopmental differences like autism. So for many women like me, when I had this discovery about myself, I reached out to my GP, only to be told via text at the time that I didn't meet the referral criteria, which is just hugely invalidating. You know, you've had this massive discovery about yourself, and you go to your GP and say, I want to have an assessment, and they say, I'm really sorry, but you don't meet the criteria. And it was a really isolating experience. And it's often why self-identifying as autistic is absolutely valid, because for a lot of people, like myself, it was the only way to do it. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about the difference between discovery and diagnosis and why language is really important here. It's why, the Late Discovered Club, I talk about my discovery, because diagnosis really is a privilege that many people can't access, especially women, especially Black and brown women. There are so many barriers to accessing that diagnostic pathway. Lots of gatekeeping from GPs who don't know what autism is. So they will say to you, well, you've got this far in life, you've got a relationship, you've got a job, you've got a career, you can't possibly be
Oh,
autistic. And these are real things that we hear from GPs in 2025, because they have this very outdated knowledge about what autism is.
right.
And for women, we have been excluded from research around autism, and we still are. So we hear a lot, don't we, about people saying that, people jump on a bit of a bandwagon. They just decide one day that they're going to assume this identity of being autistic. But it's actually a massive health inequality for women. If you can't access something, not getting a diagnosis doesn't mean that you're not autistic, still autistic,
Yeah.
even though you can't get that diagnosis. So I self-identified for many years, eventually went back to my GP again, requested again, basically had to write an entire essay as to why I thought that I deserved to be listened to, and then got an NHS autism diagnosis several years later. And I think, for diagnosis, when my assessor finally, kind of assessed me on the NHS, and she said to me, what does this mean, Catherine, to you of getting this diagnosis? And by this point, I'd had years of deep diving, of trying to understand myself. And I said to her, I have a sense of peace because I no longer have to do this discovery work, because it is utterly consuming. Because you start to think to yourself, well, how have I managed to miss this? Once somebody kind of wipes that windscreen and you see yourself through a different lens, it seems so very obvious as to why and to how. And you start asking yourself all of these questions about, what if I'd have known earlier? Would that knowledge have safeguarded me maybe from some other harm that I've been exposed to throughout my life? Would I have understood all my kind of, co-occurring health conditions that go alongside being autistic? Would that have been better understood? So it is a really discombobulating time. It was for me.
Right.
And once you then have that discovery about yourself, or diagnosis, and you then start to maybe tell colleagues at work, or loved ones, people in your family, you can often get, and we do get, lots of invalidation. So people start to make assumptions. They will often say, well, you don't look autistic. You don't fit my idea of what autism, and I hear that all the time. And I can't imagine any other thing that you would disclose about yourself that somebody would say, oh, but you don't look it. You don't seem it. Even in hospital settings, going through my cancer treatment, beyond my medical record, and I would disclose that I'm autistic. And immediately the oncologist would start talking to me like I was 5 years old. Or would
Wow.
actually, somebody even said to me, you're too articulate, Catherine, to be autistic. And I just shake my head. So I had this real fear about coming out as being autistic.
Yeah.
How would people perceive me? Would people think I couldn't do my job anymore? It's a really, really challenging thing to have to go through and experience. And there's lots of people who will say that, self-identifying isn't valid. You can only be autistic if a doctor diagnoses you. But if we can't access an assessment pathway, and you have to self-identify, then you are navigating this alone. So think of all the people who are in the workplaces today who can't access a diagnosis, who know
Yeah.
that they are autistic, but are absolutely petrified at saying to their line manager, I'm autistic, and then turning around and saying, you can't be, you don't look autistic, but you haven't got a diagnosis. And it's not just, I mean, my story is motherhood, and there's lots of people who discover they are autistic in motherhood for a variety of reasons. But menopause is another big one.
Yeah.
Hitting perimenopause and menopause. We didn't even start to research women, autistic women, and menopause until 2020. So we have not even asked the question about what it feels like to be autistic going through menopause. But it's often the point when many women will say the wheels started to fall off, because all of this kind of scaffolding that you've put around yourself and masking when you hit menopause, it just all falls apart. And
Yeah.
so there's that real, we're hearing lots more, aren't we, in workplaces about menopause, and we're doing lots more awareness raising. But there's these very real intersectional challenges for some women around menopause. Many will struggle at those transition points of university. So if you've got a graduate coming into your workplace, that might be the first time that they have had to establish a brand new routine where their environmental stresses are too much for them. You might see them really struggle with that. They might end up going off with burnout, with autistic burnout. Motherhood, work, crashing out of jobs, education because of burnout or because of abuse or victimization in the workplace. I mean, it's huge. It's huge. And I talk about the struggles, but there are some massive advantages, I feel, for me, of having this discovery later in life. And that is that it has enabled me to really start living my life the way I need to start living my life, really nurturing my strengths, supporting my struggles, continuing to make the adaptations that I need in my life, and really seeking out accommodations from others that are going to help me. But I have a sense of privilege, I suppose, because I am self-employed. I don't have to go into a workplace and
Right.
disclose this about myself. For many people, it is not safe to disclose. There's still so much stigma. The way that people talk about autism, the language that they use. Language is such, I think, a powerful safety mechanism, but such a underrated and underused mechanism that we have, because we can all educate ourselves, can't we? We can all learn about language that isn't offensive, that isn't discriminatory. You'll notice when I'm talking that I use identity first language rather than person first. So I will say I am autistic rather than I have autism.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is because it's part of my neurology. It's how I experience the world. I can't detach my brain or my neurology from my body, just like
Yeah.
you can't do that, Nick. You can't say, right, well, I'm just going to put my neurology to one side today and leave it here.
Yeah.
Um, and when I say, well, if I have autism, then it suggests it's something that maybe I can be without, or I should want to be
Mm.
without. And we then get into that whole kind of cure rhetoric that autism's a disease, or it's an illness, or it's a condition, or a mental health problem. It's something that should be treated, and it's none of those things. It is a neurodevelopmental difference. And even me just touching on some of this with you on this episode, it just goes to show, doesn't it, how important, before we even think about getting a policy or a strategy in our
Yeah.
organization about neuroinclusion, and autism's just one neurodevelopmental difference that we're talking about here. Getting language right is so incredibly important, but it's the bit that I think we fail at as a society. But we've got to want to learn, we've got to want to be curious. When I disclose that I'm autistic, what I don't want somebody to say is they think it's a compliment saying that you don't look autistic. I know that they have an outdated image in their head of what they think autism is. So that signals to me that, well, you're not really a safe person to be having a conversation
Yeah.
with because you don't see me. Actually, what I would like you to say is, I don't really understand anything about autism. I'd be really curious if you could help me understand a little bit more.
Well, the good news is that's exactly what we're going to try and do in this podcast today is at least open the book so that people can see inside and start to get a better understanding of that. I mean, first of all, Catherine, thank you. That was an incredibly powerful sort of story that you've shared with us and deeply personal. I know there'll be quite a lot of people listening to this who may be experiencing similar struggles that you did. So just before we turn to sort of employers and workspace type arrangements, can I just go back to the point you made around how difficult it was for you to get the medical profession, particularly your GP, to even accept that there was a need for a diagnosis? Is there anything that you did other than writing the essay that you referred to? Was there any tips or tricks that you could give to people who are right now in the position that you were in before you received your diagnosis to help them get that diagnosis and to get any help and support that they may subsequently need. Any tips or tricks on that?
Yeah, I mean, you can, there's right to choose on the NHS. So I think a lot of patients don't realise that they have a right to choose. So even if they don't fit the criteria for their local autism or ADHD pathway, they can choose a provider that's on the NHS right to choose and ask to be referred. So that's one of the things, don't feel disempowered. You have a right to choose. We have a patient charter in the NHS.
Right.
So think about that. And yet you do have to go kind of armed with the information about yourself. So if you're speaking to a GP who knows nothing about autism, and for many GPs, I mean, many mental health professionals, not just GPs and health professionals, don't have any training around autism or what autism is. So you're probably more informed than they are. They are a gatekeeper who is just there to say, yeah, well, we can refer you on and put you into in touch with a specialist. So really, really do the work on yourself, really understand. It's part, I know we're going to talk about the book, but it is partly why I wrote the book, because it takes you on a journey of really exploring all these different worlds that you go through when you discover that you're autistic. And there's lots of journal prompts in there, and you can really prepare something that you can then present to your GP. I wish we didn't have to do that, but we do.
Yeah, but it was really interesting. Two things you said there that I think really resonate, and I hope listeners take away with them. First of all, the right to choose, because we do forget that that is there in the NHS for across all the range of services. But I think secondly that GPs are gatekeepers. They do actually either refer you on for medication, no matter what it is, or for further treatment and tests. And again, I think all too often. People don't necessarily see their GP services as being in effect that part of the NHS process. So really helpful. Thank you for that. Let me move on then. So I suppose obviously in preparation for today, I've done a fair amount of reading and research and continued to learn myself as well, which has been really good for me. One of the stats I came across, which I found absolutely shocking, was that around 1 in 7 people in the UK are neurodivergent, but employment rates are much, much lower than this. And basically, the Office for National Statistics, for example, um, has concluded that only 22% of autistic people are employed. So that's a huge figure that of people who feel, for whatever reason, excluded from the workplace. So, just from your perspective, what do you think are the biggest barriers that autistic and neurodivergent individuals face in the workplace today? And also just any of your own experience as well, which would be helpful to shine a light on that.
Yeah, I mean, there are unfortunately so many barriers. I'm in my 10th year of self-employment, and I personally, I often oscillate between wanting security but needing autonomy, uh, wanting to be part of a team but not being able to find the right environment that can accommodate my needs, wanting to use my skill set but not being able to find a role that would allow me to work from home and on a part-time basis. And I see roles that are advertised. I'm often on LinkedIn and I think, wow, that looks like a brilliant role. I could use my skills to do that, because it's a really lonely place being self-employed. But then I see the barriers that are inbuilt in the recruitment process. So, for example, things like the application process. Some roles, there is so much bureaucracy. The psychometric tests, they by default then exclude those people who think differently. Interviews will exclude those who communicate and process differently. For me, I have a very different processing style. So, putting me in an exam situation, I would fail. I have to have a script. I have to have words in front of me. That's just part of my autistic dyspraxic brain. That doesn't mean that I am not good at what I do, but I need help to support me through that. And if I am seeing jobs that are advertised that don't talk about if you have a disability, of being able to work flexibly, or different options for interview, give me the option to record a video like this. Let me
Yeah.
talk to you. Let me get across what I want to say in a different way. And what happens when you're somebody like me then, who's autistic, who's multiply neurodivergent, I'm disabled, I use a power chair, I live with multiple health conditions. What that means is that I am effectively excluded from the workplace because I am shoehorned into self-employment. And what self-employment brings then, I don't have any occupational health department, I don't have a HR department, I don't
Yeah.
have any health, sickness, holiday provision, I work alone. I have all the responsibility, I am everything in my business. I have to do every part of it. And I think some of those barriers and some of the reasons why that employment rate is so low is because so many people have been forced into that position, into freelance, into contract work, into, very unstable employment. Um, I spent a lot of my career in the NHS, in local government. So I left the NHS over a decade ago. I was head of workforce transformation for a really large acute trust. I was a lead strategist on the national workforce strategy for a period of time. Um, and I climbed the ladder and I, did all my leadership programs and all those things, put myself forward for roles that I could do. But there were always points in my career where I just didn't perform in the way that other people would. And the amount of effort I had to put in to perform in the way that they prescribed was just, I ended up burning out in my early 30s, and I had no option but to leave the workforce. It wasn't until I did a role recently in the last couple of years as a trainer for the National Autism Training Programme, as a contract role with the NHS. And the entire process of they wanted autistic professionals to be delivering this training to mental health professionals in the
Yeah.
NHS. The whole process from start to finish was the first time I have ever experienced anything that I would deem neuroinclusive. It was a really clearly defined role. They were really explicit. They said, we want to recruit disabled autistic professionals. It's 100% from home. It's an open interview process. So we're going to send you the questions in advance. So it's not a test of my memory ability, but it's really an opportunity to get across, my skills and experience. It was an online panel interview, and the whole process felt safe. And I think that's worth, I really wanted to share that because that is something that we could do. That is something that all organisations could do, to really tap into neurodivergent talent. If we are lucky to be employed, and find that role that accommodates us, what we will find then is lots of challenges in the workplace. So think about it on an environmental level, not just the design and the space of where you're working, but certainly being autistic, my neurology, it takes everything in, it takes too much in. So everything can feel like an assault daily on my nervous and sensory system. And if you don't experience that and you don't experience the world in the way that I do, you're not going to hear that noise. That noise is not going to drive you mad all day.
Yeah.
You're not going to be exposed to temperatures that either make you too hot or too cold, and you can never find the right temperature. We have sensory systems that over or under respond, often a combination of both. So think of noise, small talk, hot desking, which is often hot messing, not hot desking, because there's no structure, there's
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
routine, there's no predictability, and autonomy is really, really fundamental to autistic neurology. Hot desking gives you none of that. Even working at home, I live in a ground floor apartment. I have people above me and below me, and even hearing the woman cough downstairs whilst I'm talking, I have to sit with headphones on at home, but I'm self-employed. So there's no blanket policy in my workplace that says, Catherine, if you're hearing a noise that is distracting you from being able to focus, you can't wear your headphones. I have that autonomy, but I know, and I've spoken about this at length on the podcast, there are people in workplaces where there are these blanket rules about, well, we want to treat everybody the same. So therefore, inclusion is treating everybody the same. And we know that inclusion is not treating everybody
Yeah.
the same. It's about giving choice and autonomy. when I was a strategist in the NHS, I was based up in Leeds, but I would have to travel a lot down to London, and these were in the days before Zoom and conference calls. You would have to go physically to a 10-minute meeting in the middle of London and then go to your next meeting. And I found that so stressful. I got lost so many times. And I found it quite a shameful and embarrassing thing to say that, I would get lost and I would have to find a police officer to help me navigate where I needed to be. And there would have been, looking back now, if I'd have known then what I know now about myself, I would have been saying to my team, to my manager, I need a real printout of a visual-based narrative. Show me a
Yeah,
kind of social story from the point of getting on the train to where the meeting is. I need you to map that out for me and not give me directions, but show me pictures on a piece of paper. What else are barriers in the workplace? I've touched on this about different communication and processing styles. Forced participation in social events. If you've managed to get into the workplace and you've somehow disassociated from yourself and the environment enough to be able to do your work, that forced participation in social events, then when you've already got a very low social battery, doesn't give people autonomy and choice. And again, we switch that to a thing of rather than forced participation, but actual choice and autonomy. I might say, well, I'm going to come then, but I'm only going to stay for 20 minutes. Or actually, I don't drink alcohol. So going in the pub with you is just not my thing. But that doesn't mean that I don't want to be involved or I'm not social. It's just not for me. There's lots of stigma in workplaces as well. There was a recent episode on the podcast from a guy called Tristan, who was he was a detective. He's retired now. He's a detective in Kent Police, and he had a late discovery. And he said that he would hear his colleagues talking about autistic people in such derogatory ways. How could he then disclose his late diagnosis to his colleagues? What would they think of him? Would they think that he could lead a murder investigation, even though he's spent his entire career doing that? So this idea of not having that psychological safety at work, it's not safe to be me, it's not safe to disclose. We hear lots of stories about abuse, bullying, interpersonal victimization that happens when people don't value difference.
yeah.
I mean, there's so much I could do an entire episode on barriers. I really could about, health, co-occurring health conditions. We're so much more likely to experience certain co-occurring health conditions. Many of us are carers, parents to neurodivergent children. Those children can't go to school, can't access childcare. They need flexibility. So really, when you think about what we need and the foundations that we need, they need to be built from the outset. This is not just a sense of let's write a policy about neurodiversity and hope that we create an inclusive workplace and we change our
Yeah.
culture. This is about safety. It's about belonging. It's about inclusion.
There's lots there that I'm keen to unpack. And I want to come back to how you do create that safe environment that you spoke about. What advice would you give to neurotypical people about how to work best with their neurodivergent colleagues? So I, I, I think that's quite a key question, really, for me, because I think there'll be a lot of people listening to this podcast who may feel nervous or that they do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing. So really just any advice you could give to as we say neurotypical people in terms of what they should be doing.
Yeah, yeah, there's lots I could share with you here. I think the first thing I would say is, just be open and be curious, be willing to learn. Create that kind of learning environment where you can ask those questions, but it's a safe space. I think there's lots of myths, firstly, about what neurodivergence is and what it isn't. So many different terms about neurodiversity, neurodiverse, neurodivergent, all of these different terminology. I think that's a starting point of let's just get clear on language. Let's understand what all of these different terms mean. There's so many differences within that neurodiversity umbrella. I'm talking about autism today because that's my experience. And there's lots of myths that exist about what it means to be autistic. I will hear, and I hear these terms all the time. People say, oh, well, you're autistic, you can't handle change, or you lack empathy, or you can't socialize or communicate very well. And what happens when people have these outdated myths that are based on theories that have been debunked, many decades ago,
Yeah.
is that they place limitations on us and people make these outdated assumptions. Or conversely, you'll hear that people think that we all have superpowers. And many people might say that they have a superpower. Many people might talk about strengths. I certainly talk about strengths and struggles. Um, but some of the kind of practical things that you can do, I think, firstly, start with recruitment. So the way that you interview, how the process is designed, the ways that you work, the language that you use, the support that you give, the accommodations that you're willing to make, and really being explicit in saying what those are. Because often what we need is somebody to lead the way. I will say it in my therapy space with people. I will say, you can come into the space however you want to. Eye contact is not a requirement. You can look wherever you want to, however you want to present what's in your head. Some people like to do a slide deck. Some people like to draw out what they're experiencing. But you've got to be explicit in saying what are some of the things that you can do as an offering, and then really get to know the individual and think about what it is that they need.
Yeah.
This kind of blanket neurodiversity policy, what it often does is it just names a whole list of quite marginalized neurodivergent groups, but it doesn't actually say how it's going to meet individual people's needs. So if you've got a policy, really commit to creating and understanding and supporting those communities of interest across all areas of business, from floor to board, and not just during awareness days or weeks. Organizations often think, oh, it's Neurodiversity Celebration Week or it's Autism Awareness Month. Let's roll somebody in who's autistic and get them to tell us a little bit about what it means to be autistic. That is not being neuroinclusive. There's lots of ways that we are discriminated against in the workplace. And, if I think about a community of interest, and I think about my first graduate job that I did when I was in local government many, many years ago. And we had the council every year would spend their council budget on services for people. And this was back in the early 2000s. So it was quite innovative work that we were doing. But we did an entire quality of life survey and with residents to try and, identify what their needs were when it came to government spending. And we profiled all of the communities of interest within that borough and really did, focus groups and really understand their distinct needs. And I see that today in organisations when we're talking about neuroinclusion. Who are your communities of interest? How do you profile those communities? So, for example, if you have, let's take late discovered autistic women, okay, as a community of interest, we could have autistic people and we could narrow that down to different communities of interest, even within itself. Do you have spaces for them to connect in your organisation? Do you understand what the challenges that they face in your workplace? What about the intersectional challenges that they face? What support mechanisms might help them? Do you listen to their experiences? Do you learn from their experiences? What kind of support might they need across the lifespan? So when they become a parent, maybe as a carer, maybe through perimenopause, menopause, how can you really take a person-centered approach based on that individual need? Do you have safe places and faces in your organisation? What if I came today, Nick, in your organisation and said, I've just discovered that I'm autistic. Is there somebody that I can go to who isn't going to make me feel like I'm going to experience some of what I've talked about already? Is there somebody in your organisation who gets that? Ideally, everybody in your organisation would have that level of education and awareness so that if somebody disclosed to them, they're able to take that in a real psychologically safe way, in a very trauma-informed way? You know, are your HR teams and your managers, are they trauma-informed? Do they know some of this? So you could profile all of your neurodivergent kind of people in your organization and just deep dive into each of those communities and really think about that. And I imagine as an employee, if I was in an organization where they didn't just have a network or a group of people that were for neurodivergent employees, that they had a commitment in their strategy and their policy that they are doing this community profiling. They want to speak to people. They want to understand need. These are some of the things that we do. I mean, just could you imagine how safe that would make people feel? How inclusive that would make people feel?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, huge sort of a long list out of takeaways for people listening to this. Particularly in terms of not just how at an individual level, but also at an organizational level, the types of things that you can do. And certainly, I want to come back to the recruitment process in a short while when we talk about your book and some of the things that I took from that. Um, but certainly, what you said about language is absolutely spot on, because even in the preparation for this podcast, I was still talking about superpowers, which I know was one of the phrases that you highlighted there. So again, it's part of that. As an individual and also as an organization, have you really got that open mind? Are you listening and are you acting to when people are feeding back actually some of the things that you're advocating as maybe a positive or a strength, that isn't how everybody sees things. So really, really good. What I wanted to do was just slightly switch the focus now, I suppose, to celebrate what neuroinclusion brings to society, but also to businesses. So we've already mentioned before that, it brings innovation, it brings creativity, it brings what are unique problem-solving skills to the table in some cases. So do a bit of a sales pitch for me, Catherine, really. What does
Yeah.
neuroinclusion bring to the workplace? What are the key benefits? We know we still need to convince some people out there of the positive. So let's spin it round and say, these are the positive things that this brings to your business that without which you are missing.
Yeah. And again, I could talk about this all day because there are so many benefits to an organization. You've touched on there, innovation and creativity. We do bring those unique perspectives and problem-solving skills and often creative approaches to challenges. So that diversity of thought really can drive innovation. I know that my monotropic mind can dive really deep, so I can write really compelling strategies. I can theme spot. I can really connect and build relationships with partners. I see words as data. I can influence policy. I can translate all of that kind of big picture stuff into something that's really tangible and understandable. And why would you not want somebody in your organization who could do that? I wrote my first class psych masters in a week. I locked myself in my office for a week and did that, but asked me to sit a test, and I will absolutely fail at that. So if we strength nurture, we can really create that innovation and creativity. Think about problem solving and how that enhances productivity in the workplace. So if you've got neurodivergent employees who can perhaps identify solutions, maybe you're just not looking at a problem or a system or a way of working in a way that somebody else might with a different kind of brain. So, think about cognitive diversity, how that leads to ways to problem solve, how we can process things, approach tasks. You're going to access real untapped talent. So if we know that, like I'm talking about the level of people who are in self-employment who actually would love to be able to come into an organization and work in an organization with the right support. We're underemployed. We've got these really valuable, high in demand skills, and you can attract that. If you're really going to embrace neuroinclusion, you're going to attract and retain really highly capable talent that maybe you've overlooked or you've excluded through your hiring practices. back in 2022, we saw the British Intelligence Agency, GCHQ, and BAA Systems. They issued an appeal to attract more neurodivergent women to work for them in roles like cybersecurity. And they actively sought out autistic women to address some of the gaps in their workforces. And I think, well, why aren't we seeing other employers doing this? Why are other sectors not falling over themselves to do that? And really tap into that talent. Think about employee retention and engagement, and having a really strong workplace culture. The last thing you want to do as an organisation is spend lots of money on getting people into your organization only to lose them and have that real
Absolutely.
high turnover rate. So, you want loyal, satisfied, empowered employees. You'll get better customer market understanding. So our brains can often help you understand, your consumers, get into the minds of your consumers. Think about how you are more inclusive, maybe in your product design. If you're an organization that, is selling products to 20% of the population, how are your products and your marketing and your experiences inclusive? And also, something that I touch on in the book with Ed Jennison, who's an employment lawyer, is that if you're an organization who is going to prioritize neuroinclusion, you are less likely to face discrimination claims. You're more likely to be seen as a progressive, socially responsible brand organisation, which means that, I would want to work with you. I want to
Yeah.
work with an organisation who is a top 100 employer, who, really thinks about the culture and the inclusive culture. So I would just say that to summarize that a neuro-inclusive workplace really benefits everybody, not just the neurodivergent people that you employ.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of giving that help to others, I mentioned before that you do work as a psychotherapist and as a trainer and a consultant. Just again, what types of organisations are you working with, and some of the themes that are emerging from that work.
Yeah, I mean, the last 18 months I've been going through lots of cancer treatment, and I've, been working throughout it, not as much as what I would normally do, but certainly through that time period, I've designed content for the National Autism Training Programme that I talked about. So that is training all mental health staff in the NHS on how to deliver more compassionate care to autistic people. So designing the content for that training and training the mental health professionals so that they can then train this in their, train the trainer programme, train this in their organisations. I've done some guest lecturing at University College London, less and less therapy these days, much more working with, heart-led organisations really to help them, and very often holding their hand through some of this, of just working with them where they're at to really identify what they need to be doing. And for some of them, it's starting really at the beginning. It's the very basics of let's just deconstruct all of this and really understand what we're talking about here. I know we've talked about language a lot here, but just from what we've talked about, you could see how that in itself is just a starting point, isn't it, to get
It
people on
is.
board. And I think if we've got to get, winning hearts and minds, what we've got to do is we have got to get people on board. They need this information. They need to know about the new theories that are coming out that we understand, that are much more affirming, and explained in a way that they can understand without going into too much theory or too much academia. What is it? And that's partly why I wanted to write the book, was to be able to just decipher some of this and put in one place. So I want to do more and more of that work with organisations going forward to be able to help you support your neurodivergent employees.
Yeah. Can I just touch on the book actually? Because I want to come back to your podcast after this, but
Yeah.
obviously, as you've very sort of openly shared there, you've You've written a book, and I'm people who listen to this podcast will know I'm always in awe of anybody who has the passion to be able to write a book. And it's incredible, I always think, to think about the amount of time and effort that goes into that. But also to do that as you have done at a time when you're also undergoing treatment for cancer. I just think that's like a double wow, double awe sort of for me, for you. And so really with all that going on in your life, what inspired you to write this book? And really, how do you find the time even? How do you find the energy? Yeah, I'm sure many people listening to this will just be like, wow, I can't believe she's actually been able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, the podcast was one thing. So that, and I know you want to talk about the podcast, and I'm going to talk about that now, but not everybody wants to come on a podcast and share their story with the world. So what I wanted to try and do was create a guide for anybody who discovers later in life that they're autistic. And there's nothing for allies either, whether that's a family, a friend, or a work colleague, or a manager to understand us. So I wanted to create this book that could share lots of voices, not just my voice. There's over 100 contributions in there spanning 7 decades. But to really just dive deeper into my own story, get all of that recent research that we know about women and autism and just put it in a book,
Right.
so that we've got something, because it doesn't exist. So I thought, right, I need to write this book. It does, it's like saying that something does not exist out there. Well, I need to create it, and I want to do that. So back at the beginning of 2023, I put a book proposal together and approached Jessica Kingsley Publishing, who specialise in neurodiversity and autism books, and put my proposal in, not thinking anything of it. And literally days later, I got an email from who is now my commissioning editor, Linda, instantly said, we need to have a Zoom call about this. And we chatted, and she took the proposal forward. My book got acquired in May 2023. I signed the contract, and I had to write the book by December 2023. But
Wow.
literally 2 months after signing that contract, I got diagnosed with a grade 3 aggressive type of breast cancer, and it already spread to my lymph nodes. So I had to start chemotherapy and 18 months of cancer treatment ahead of me. And I so wanted to write this book. And I describe it in the book as like this mountain just appearing in front of me. And I suppose there was an element of fear that I don't know if I'm going to survive my cancer. Um, and I've got all of this. It's like I've been deep diving, and I've collected all of this on the bed of the ocean, and I want to bring it to the surface. Um, so I found a way of doing it. I couldn't write. I lost my creativity during chemo, and I was really scared that it would never come back. So as
Right.
soon as I had this window between finishing chemo last Christmas and having surgery and starting my radiotherapy, I had a 3 month kind of treatment window where I started to feel like me a little bit again. It's like, right, I just need to write this book. So every night, between 8 o'clock and midnight, when my 6-year-old was asleep, that's what I did. I got on the sofa, I put something on YouTube that was, some kind of cafe that I imagined I was in Copenhagen somewhere, and the snow was falling down, and I had some nice coffee shop jazz music on, the candles were lit, and I just got under a blanket, and I wrote the book, and I wrote the vast majority of it in about a space of 4 to 6 weeks last
Wow.
January. And that's what motivated me really is, what if I don't make it to the top of the mountain? What if I lose my creativity forever? And it gave me something to really focus on. I think a lot of the time people, when you're going through cancer, people often say to you, you need to stop work, you need to do this. Actually working for me in a way that worked for me really helped me focus. I felt like not only did I have to get to the top of the mountain by December 2024, we're finishing my treatment, but that was also when around about the time that my book would come out. I mean, it ended up coming out a few weeks ago. So I had this vision of getting to the top of the mountain, and I'm sure that not only motivated me to write the book, but it also helped me go through this treatment, because cancer is not something that you kind of go into a battle with. It's something that, climbing a mountain, people set out to climb mountains all the time, don't they?
Yeah.
You don't know if you're going to make it to the top. You might get weather conditions that wipe you out, and so that's really what motivated me to do it. And I'm so glad that I did. I ended up getting breast cancer again in October last year, and in my other breast, and that kind of put me on a bit of a detour. But it's just such a relief. It's a relief to finish my treatment, to be sat here today and also talking about my book.
And again, you may not want to go down this road, but I know you've already got, not only have you just celebrated the publication of this book, but you've got another one in the works, entitled "When the Body Says Enough." And that one's obviously, by its very title, so it's quite personal. But any highlights or anything that you could share from your early thinking around that book that would help our listeners today as well?
Yeah, there's a chapter in Rediscovered that talks about when the body screams enough. And I could have just kept writing that chapter. So when I was writing that book, I put a proposal together to the publisher and said, I need to write an entire book on this chapter. And that they acquired it. And again, I've got to write the manuscript by November this year. So hopefully I'm not going to have any mountains put in front of me on this one. But this one is really an extension of what I talk about around autistic burnout, chronic ill health. So it's really going to explore pain and fatigue, and really just give a space for stories to be heard and our pain and fatigue better understood and supported. And I think certainly for workplaces who are, supporting neurodivergent employees who have co-occurring physical health conditions and will go off with burnout, really help them to understand as well what more that they could be doing to support people. And I mean, really, we just want to be living in an environment that doesn't put us into a stress response every single day.
And I know from reading your book myself, and the chapter on workplaces we thrive in, my big takeaway from that was interestingly quite a lot of what you've already covered, particularly how many women are forced out of the workplace and into self-employment, but not out of choice, but because they're unsupported and also misunderstood. But I think the thing that I found shocking was the examples of bullying, of abuse, and interpersonal victimization as well, and that being a common experience. And again, going back to one of your very early comments in this podcast around, it's 2025, and yet this is still something that's being experienced in terms of trying to access GP services. That in the workplace as well was just another one of those, is this really happening today type moments of my life. And I think the other thing I thought you really helpfully did in the book was, and again, we've touched on it, but talked about recruitment and the way that you interview, how the process is designed. We've talked about language and the importance of language, but how important that is. And also this isn't having a blanket policy. This is actually about diversity. It's actually about, understanding the individual and tailoring the approach to those individual needs. So I suppose they were my key takeaways from that. But I know also you've got a hugely successful podcast. And what have been the main takeaways for you from that podcast? What nourishment has it given you and support? But also, I suppose, for people listening to this podcast, what would be the benefits? I never normally give people an opportunity to sell their podcasts on our podcast, Catherine. So this is a first, I think, in Raising the Roof history. But you know, there's an opportunity here for you to also, highlight to people what they'll get from your podcast.
Yeah, the podcast began because I couldn't find any stories that really unveiled these stories from women, these stories that have been missing. Autistic women's voices have been missing from the narrative for so long. So I really wanted to create a podcast that not only explored these stories, but could also, dispel some of the myths, could deconstruct some of those stereotypes. And I really wanted to do it all through an intersectional lens. And it's not just women that we have on the podcast, as many men who come on as well to share their story, because men are also late discovered.
Yeah.
So the podcast for me it's really enabled me to step into my space as a storyteller. I really love being a podcast host and exploring people's stories and giving people the space to be able to do that. I don't think we have anywhere where somebody just gives you the space like you're giving to me today, where somebody's not interjecting all the time or asking you questions. So having that space to be able to do that. But also giving some visibility to the next generation. So I don't want the next generation of autistic girls to grow up not being able to see somebody who is an autistic woman, who perhaps they can aspire to, somebody who they can absolutely see themselves in. So there's lots of different stories. But the great thing about the podcast is that I don't necessarily interview celebrities. These are real people from real walks of life. And they're the stories that the audience connects with the most. I've had very famous people on the podcast, but they are not the episodes that people engage with the most. It's
Yeah.
the mum who is talking about her life, who, maybe has never had this opportunity to talk about things. So it's really important to me to just give that breadth and that depth really for people to come on and talk.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it is a real privilege being a podcast host. And I feel exactly the same as you do, just the breadth and depth of experiences that you get to understand and the types of people in terms of engagement levels, very much those with the really personal stories. So what I'm going to do is just finish off with one last question before I do flip the mic. So looking to the future, if you could wave a magic wand, what are the key areas that need improvement to enable neurodivergent professionals thrive in the workplaces? So if you could do two or three things, what would they be to change the future to be a better place?
Yeah, I think we've got to uh talk about this a lot, safe places, faces and spaces. It's always quite a mouthful to say, but I really mean that. We've got to create those safe spaces, and safety starts with language. Let's just start with language. Let's get an agreement on what language is okay and what isn't okay. And we've got to be equitable and we've got to be inclusive. And I think, diversity is a human fact, isn't it?
Yeah.
Diversity exists. Inclusion is a choice. Inclusion is something that we can choose to do. And if we're going to be inclusive, we've got to enable choice and autonomy. We have got to not treat everybody the same. We've got to do different things and we've got to be very person-centered. And I can't emphasize this enough, that it's great if you're an organization that has a strategy or policy or something that is talking about wanting to be more neuro-inclusive. But let's not steer away from the individual here. My needs are going to be very different to the next person's needs and the next person's needs. Let's really think about how we can enable neurodivergent people to thrive in environments. Let's recognize and accommodate their unique strengths and struggles. Let's not make assumptions about what those are. And also, I would say, if you don't know how to do this, it is okay to say, I need some help and some support. There are people who can help you do this, but my ask would be, please get somebody in who has lived experience of what you're going to be doing. That's really important. And I think to be safe and equitable and inclusive, it takes leaders like you, Nick, having this conversation today to really lead that change, to really commit to wanting to be a better ally. Change does not happen without leaders like you saying, this is something that we're going to commit to and it's something that we want to do.
No, that's very kind of you, but always keen to learn and improve because I think the moment you think you've cracked something is the moment that you've become complacent and you're probably slipping backwards. So yeah, always keen to push myself and others to be even better. So um, Talking of which, obviously, as a seasoned podcaster, this will be the bit that you're probably the most excited about. It's our flip the mic section, where we give you, as our guest, the chance to ask a couple of searching questions directed at me. So, this is your opportunity to ask me absolutely anything, Catherine. So fire away.
Yeah, I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to ask you these questions because I'm really interested. I live in Yorkshire. I was born in Yorkshire. I'm really interested to know what Yorkshire Housing are doing to create more autistic inclusive spaces and faces and places. And secondly, what you can do, Nick, as a leader to be a better ally. How can you help power progress? So what you're doing organisationally, and then secondly, what you can do as a leader.
Okay. Oh, wow. Great questions. So, organizationally, we have a series of colleague networks, and one of those is my ability. So, that's for our neurodivergent colleagues. And I think it's fair to say the group have made cracking progress on breaking down barriers. And our aim is to be a truly inclusive employer. So, to do that, we recognise that we need to understand and tap into what you referred to before, that lived experience. So, what better than to get a group of people who can share their experiences of what isn't working at Yorkshire Housing, so that we then know what we can do to fix that. Um, because there's always more we can do for the reasons I mentioned before, and I think my ability I've found to be really valuable to Yorkshire Housing, yes, but also to me on a personal level as well. So it provides me with a really supportive space to share experiences, to understand why those experiences are significant at an individual level, and really as part of that drive to make us more inclusive. So I meet with the chair of the group on a regular basis, on a one-to-one basis, and I have learned huge amount from that time with Hannah. I think the other thing I've done is visibly supported their events. They run lunch and learn sessions covering what it's like to live with ADHD, Asperger's, autism. But more importantly than that, I think they do provide a reality check. So they test our systems to ensure that they are truly accessible and that we've thought everything through. And invariably we haven't. So they come back with some suggestions, which is all really good because it feeds into how we make Yorkshire House in a space where colleagues feel heard, valued, and supported. So a slightly different set of words to the ones you used before, but very much with the same intent. The other thing they've done, the My Ability Colleague Network, have helped design our workplace. So it's designed to be natural, welcoming. None of those open plan spaces, interestingly, which you referred to, that can be overstimulating and intimidating. We want it to be a space where people choose to come to, not because they're mandated for X number of days a week, because we don't work like that, but people choose to come to that space for all the right reasons. So things like colours, textures, finishes, all chosen with the subconscious very much as a major consideration. So gone are the days of, we never had banks of desks and bland colours, but needless to say, you won't see any of that there. But that's also underpinned by something we've had in place for a number of years now, which is our hub, home, and roam approach to giving colleagues freedom and flexibility to decide when, how, and also where they work. Um, and that enables us to, I suppose, build an employer offer around responding to the different needs of colleagues because we've spoken on this podcast before, interestingly, about all the focus all too often is on recruiting really good people. But my view is you should be retaining really talented people as well. So what we want to do by all of that is to then create a safe space, an inclusive space, a space where people feel valued, where they do fantastic work, but actually when they are tempted to go and work elsewhere, that they realise actually, you know what Yorkshire Housing gives me, I can't find elsewhere, and actually it makes me want to commit to the business even more. So in terms of me, I think my job, I always say my job is to set the culture of the business. So to do that, I recognise I need to educate myself and to learn and to understand. So that's why I do some of the things I mentioned before. But also, as your book suggests, extend that to the way that we recruit as well. And we have, markedly changed our recruitment process. It's still not where it needs to be. I'll fully acknowledge that, but I think there are a lot of adjustments and a lot of changes that we've made to enable us to appeal to a much wider workforce. Linked to what I've talked before around, flexible workplaces and policies. But most importantly for me as an ally, I think it's about the language I use. I think it's about how I adjust my leadership and my communication style, and also through being supportive and visible. But also, I think it's also about showing how career growth is available for everybody in the business, and that actually we have, a very diverse range of personalities, people, skills, qualities that across the business, and that's something we really welcome. Because believe me, Catherine, the last thing you would want is 950 nicks in the business. So yeah, we definitely need to make sure that we've got that complete diversity. So we're not there by any stretch of the imagination. And as I said before, as soon as you think you are, that's the alarm bell ringing because you've become complacent. But
Mm.
certainly in terms of those two questions you've asked me there, they're probably what I'd summarize as being the key areas for me.
Yeah, and to hear you talk about not having mandated policies and your hub home Rome approach, that is giving choice and autonomy, isn't it, to people, to everybody, because everybody wants choice and autonomy. It's not just your neurodivergent employees. This approach benefits everybody, all of your employees. But I also think that what you're doing at Yorkshire Housing, there's something about identifying some of this good practice, isn't there? And really sharing some of that good practice, talking about more about what you're doing, because not everybody is doing it well. Not everybody is at the point that Yorkshire Housing is, and there's still so much work to do, but it's really encouraging to hear you talk about what you're doing.
Oh, thank you. And I'm extremely lucky that I've got so many talented people in the business. And I think our view generally is that most organisations don't treat their colleagues like grown-up adults. They mandate and tell them what they need to do, when they should eat their lunch, when they should work, where they should work, all those sorts of things. And our approach is very different. And I think that's enabled us to have, a very talented set of colleagues that are doing some fantastic things at the moment. So conscious of time. So we're now heading into quick fire questions. So I'm going to give you 30 seconds max on just two quick fire sessions to end the session, please, Catherine. So first one is, what's one piece of advice you'd give to any employer listening to this podcast today who wants to become truly neuro-inclusive and tap into the unique strengths of neurodivergent people?
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, I would just say focus on being person-centered, focus about enabling choice, focus on autonomy, focus on not treating everybody the same, focus on the fact that diversity is a human fact, isn't it? And that inclusion is a choice.
Great stuff. So my final question. Fast forward 5 years, what do you hope the world will look like from a neurodivergent person's perspective?
Yeah, I just want it to be safer. That's what I want, a safer world, more inclusive employers, more equitable spaces and approaches, and leaders who want to get it right, leaders who want to be those allies who are leading that change.
What a great way to bring things to a close, because sadly it is time to close the door on this episode of Raising the Roof. Catherine, a huge thank you to you for sharing what is a absolutely inspirational and humbling story, and there are a whole list of invaluable insights that you've given us there. And of course, a big thank you to all of you, our listeners, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's conversation, then please be sure to hit that subscribe button, and also let us know what you think about the topics we've covered today. And don't forget to check out Catherine's podcast and books for a whole lot more. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.